1 Samuel 17. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul's defiance, his direct disobedience, cost him it secured and just kind of made even more sure his loss of the kingdom to his family, and God forsook him. You remember what he did. He was commanded by God through Samuel, go and destroy Amalek. And he went, and he destroyed most of Amalek. He destroyed some of Amalek, but he left the very best of the sheep and of the goats, and then he kept King Agag. And of course, that led to some issues later on. That was in 1 Samuel 15. In 1 Samuel 16, God chose him, a man after his own heart. David is anointed king by Samuel in Bethlehem. So Israel has two anointed kings. But Saul, obviously, still in control, and he's still the one who the nation is looking for, because David is a very young man. And not to say that young men can't be kings. Men younger than David will be king a little bit later in the Old Testament. But also in 1 Samuel 16, Saul is beset by an evil spirit. And in order to calm him, they were talking, and they said, what we need is somebody who can play the harp. Somebody said, I know somebody who can play the harp. It's the son of Jesse over in Bethlehem. And so they brought David to play the harp in the presence of Saul in his palace, which would have been in Gibeah. And so, for the first time recorded, the paths of Saul and David converge. They come together. And it's a time of national turmoil when we come to 1 Samuel 17. Saul still rules from Gibeah, but the nation of Israel is being attacked by their oldest foe, or one of their oldest foes, the Philistines. And so, we'll start off this evening with the battle setting. Take a look at verse 1, and in just a moment I'll show you some maps and pictures and such. It says, Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shochoh, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shochoh and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. So the Philistines have long been the enemy of the children of Israel. And you see right here is where Philistia is. It's on the southwestern coast of the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. And so they are right here. They are up against the sea. They're kind of sandwiched between the sea and the tribe of Judah. And so that's where the Philistines are. They're a Canaanite people. They should have been wiped out. They weren't wiped out when the children of Israel came in under Joshua. They didn't finish the job. And as a result of that, the Philistines would be a thorn in their side ongoing. You remember in the book of Judges, the Philistines were a problem. Samson famously fought against the Philistines. Much of the conflict and the battles that we've already mentioned in 1 Samuel have been between Israel and the Philistines. Obviously, in 1 Samuel 15, it was between Israel and Amalek, but most other than that, we're talking about the Philistines and Israel.
Is there still a remnant of these folks still causing issues?
I'm sure that there are some who could trace back to them, but there's not a Philistine people group that I'm aware of today. I'm sure if you trace genealogically back, you could probably get pretty close. Yeah. So here again, you have the tribe of Judah. They share the most border with the Philistine territory, and it is into the Judean territory that the Philistines advance. That's where we find ourselves here this evening. They come to Shochoh, which belongeth to Judah. So I'm going to put a map up here, and this is showing you a little bit. So you see they come out of Philistia on the northwestern side, and they make the trip over to Shochoh, which is right by Azekah. So we'll talk about that in just a moment, and I'll show you some pictures. They pitch their camp. They rally and assemble their army between Shochoh and Azekah. So you see both of those on this map. It's spelled Shochoh, but the same place. So you have Shochoh and Azekah. Here is a view. So if you look up here, and I'm going to step over to this side, up on this hilltop right here is Azekah. or what's left of it, the archaeological dig where they're exhuming relics from Azekah. And this area right here, what we'll talk about in a few moments, is the Valley of Elah. So this is looking west. This is looking towards the Philistine territory. This is looking towards the Mediterranean. This would be the Elah Valley looking that direction. Take a look at verse 2. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the Valley of Elah and set the battle in array against the Philistines. So you have the Philistines, they're pitched right in this area right here between Azekah and Shoko, and you have the children of Israel, they're in another place on the other side of the valley. Here is the other direction. So right here you're looking west. Right here you're looking east towards Bethlehem. So Gath and Bethlehem are almost parallel. Okay, there's a little bit of distance, probably 30 miles between Bethlehem and Gath, and the Elah Valley runs between the two. The Elah Valley runs east to west between Gath and Bethlehem. So interesting that the fight that is about to take place takes place between a man from Gath and a boy from Bethlehem. So the Elah Valley runs this distance here. The Philistines, they encamped right here. So this is where we're standing right now. Where this, if we were taking the picture, we're standing where the children of Israel had their army arrayed. And we're looking across the valley. You see, it's not that much of a valley. It's they call them cliffs. And in reading about them, the cliffs that are there are 30 meters high. So I usually think of higher to be a cliff, but 30 meters is what you're looking at. So more hills than mountains, perhaps. But this would be looking over, right here, would be the end of the Philistine encampment, and then they're stretching out across those mountains. So we're standing on the Israelite army side, and we're looking across the valley at the Philistines. This would be the southwestern rim between Shoko and Azekah. And then this would be the opposite side. This would be looking at the Israelite side. Now, this are the cliffs that I was telling you about 30 meters. Okay, the cliffs here likely weren't there in the days of David. This was likely, they came in and they quarried rock out of this particular area. So this hill would have come down a little bit more, and that's where the Israelites pitched their tents. So you have the Israelite army on the northern side, the northeastern side. You have the Philistines arrayed on the southwestern rim of this, and then you have no man's land in between. No man's land is the Valley of Elah, which is where we are going to be focused here. Verse 3, and the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. Again, just kind of giving us an encapsulated form. They're kind of in a deadlock. What's one thing in a battle? Do you want to be fighting uphill, or would you rather be at the top of the hill defending uphill? You'd rather fight downhill, right? So you have two armies on two different hills. So who moves first? Whoever moves first loses the uphill advantage, right? They're going to be fighting up at the next people. So nobody wants to move. The Valley of Elah is kind of a tricky place like that. And so a champion comes forth. His name, you are very familiar with, is Goliath in verse 4. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So you have Goliath of Gath. Again, Gath, just a couple of miles west. He's not far from home. He could walk home. The distance from where he is between Shoko and Azekah to Gath, 10 miles maybe. He could get home pretty easy. He's got closer to a home court advantage than anyone here. If he were to walk in this evening, Goliath, the first thing we would probably notice about him would be he's a really, really big guy. We read here that he was 6 cubits and a span. 6 cubits. A cubit is the distance between the elbow and the highest fingertip of an average man, and it's usually about 18 inches. And then a span is around half a cubit. It's the distance from fingertip to thumb tip, again, on an average man's hand. So, depending on whose cubit we're talking about, cubit could be a little bit bigger, a little bit shorter. Going with the 18-inch assumption, that means he comes up to about 9 foot 9 inches tall. Here is something to kind of put that into perspective. The average American male right now is 5 foot 9. The average NBA player is 6'6". Obviously, there are some who are taller and a couple who are shorter, but 6'6" is around the average height. So if you see here, Goliath of Gath is 9 foot 9 inches tall. I think it's still the case that the distance from the court to the rim of a regulation basketball hoop is 10 feet. So he's almost bumping his head on the rim of the basketball court. So the average man is looking him right about in the belt buckle. You think that would be an advantage in hand-to-hand combat? He's got quite the weight class of his own that he's fighting in. Now, there's more interesting, because when you think about the tallest men you know, I looked up the tallest man on record. His name was Robert Wadlow. He holds the Guinness World Record for the tallest man for as long as they've been keeping records. Wadlow was 8 foot 11 inches tall. This is a picture of him with his father, who they say was of average height, but he's a little bit shorter than what average would be today. Robert Wadlow was a pretty big guy, 8 foot 11 inches tall, almost 9 feet. If you get online, you can find his shoe next to a size 12. He wore a size 37. So his shoe is epic in size. And he had a deal with a shoemaker back in the day, and he got all of his shoes for free if they could make sure that he was wearing their shoe. Good advertising for them. But big guy. But if you'll notice, he's extremely tall, and he's also kind of spindly. It's during his lifetime, Robert Wadlow had to walk with braces on his legs because of his height, because of the proportion of his body. He also said that he had very, very little feeling in his legs at all. Didn't have a lot there. So he's kind of ill-proportioned, very, very tall man. We can understand that is not the case for Goliath. Goliath, not a spindly man, and we know that because we look at verse 5. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. 5,000 shekels of brass is his chainmail armor that he would wear. Typically, that would go from the shoulders, obviously, sometimes up onto the neck, and it would go to just about the knee level. So he's got a coat of mail that weighs 5,000 shekels of brass. That translates to 125 pounds that he walked around with. So he's walking around with 125 pounds of armor. That's just what he's wearing from the shoulders. Okay? If you figure in the other armor that he has, verse 6, and he had greaves of brass upon his legs and a target of brass between his shoulders. So he's got a helmet of brass on his head, and then he's got greaves of brass or leg armor, a target of brass between his shoulders. Assuming that these other implements would have added up to at least 50 pounds, he's walking around with 175 pounds of armor on him. He's practically a tank. This guy's massive. He's well protected. From a human standpoint, Goliath is the closest thing to invincible that you got on the battlefield in this day. He's massive. The average men, when he got out there, his jacket weighed what most of the men he was fighting weighed. Okay, so he's just epic in proportions. His weapons are built to size as well. Verse 7, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him. So that means that the 600 shekels of iron translates out to 16 pounds. 16 pounds of weight that he has on the end of his spear. And it says that the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. So if you were to look at what I've been looking at online recently, I've got all these interesting searches about weaver's beams and average heights and weird shoe sizes and stuff. But a weaver's beam runs about 2.5 inches around. So it's a good size. So somebody had taken the time and they figured out how long a spear that has a 16-foot head and a 2.5-inch shaft would have to be in order to make it a viable weapon. He was carrying around a 12-foot spear that was, 2.5 inches around. So he's quite the force to be reckoned with. And then somebody, I'm assuming probably the lowest ranking Philistine recruit, had to carry Goliath's shield before him. Could you imagine having that job? You got this massive mountain of a man, and I got to carry this guy's spear, this guy's shield. And Goliath's out there looking for a fight, so he probably went through shield bearers fairly quickly. Verse 8. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel. So you've got this mountain of a man in his 200 and some pounds of armor and weapons, and he's standing there, and he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them. Imagine his voice ringing. He's saying this in the valley, so his voice is ringing off the mountains around him. Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Now, this was not out of the ordinary. This was not unheard of. War was occasionally, not often I wouldn't say, but occasionally, a bigger war would be decided by a battle between champions. It wasn't unheard of in this day. In order to avoid immense bloodshed, in order to avoid pitched battle between armies, each side would pick their best, their biggest, their strongest fighter, and they would send those two out, and they would have the agreed upon rules that they would fight, but they were fighting to the death. And whoever won, whoever killed the opponent, his side won kind of vicariously through him. So, servitude for one or the other people would ride upon the outcome of this battle of champions. But the problem is that nobody wants to go fight this man. With good reason. He's massive. His spear is twice as high as everybody. And, his coat weighs more than most of the fighters. Who would be the natural choice to go out against Goliath? Let's say somebody who was maybe from the shoulders up, taller than everybody else in Israel. Saul. Do you think it's a coincidence that we have that detail, that he was taller than everybody else? He's head and shoulders above everybody else in town. So you would think, if everybody else is looking Goliath in the belt buckle, then maybe at least Saul's looking in, mid-chest. And that's the best advantage we can get. Saul's described that way in 1 Samuel 9, verse 2. It says, And there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. Not as high as Goliath was, but he's a big guy. When the people of Israel called for a king, in 1 Samuel 8, verse 19, they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. This is what they're looking for. They're looking for Saul. Here, he's the big guy around. He's the tallest Israelite we have. Let's send him out. That's why we hired you. We want you to go fight for us. They've got their champion. You be ours. But look at verse 11. As Goliath calls his defiant challenge. Verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. It's not working out well. Meanwhile, in Bethlehem. And there's kind of a sudden scene change here in Scripture. Everything changes. We start out in the Valley of Elah, and Saul and everybody, they're all quaking in their tents for fear of Goliath down in the valley. But we come here to Bethlehem in verse 12. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons. And the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. Now, we've already dealt at length with David's family tree. And so I'm not going to rehash that here. But he's the son of Jesse, Jesse hails from Bethlehem, which was in the Judean province of Ephrathah. So that's why he's called an Ephrathite. He is also a Bethlehemite. He is also a man from Judah. He hails by many names, just like somebody from Wayland. What is somebody from Waylandite? A Waylandite. So I could be called a Waylandite and an Iowan and an American. He's called a Bethlehemite and an Ephrathite, and all of these, just multiple titles for the same thing. When it says that, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul, just means that Jesse was advanced in years, beyond the point where he would be going out to battle himself. But he did send his sons, verse 13, and the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the name of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. Now, I want you to remember back, you can look or you can look at the screen, in 1 Samuel 16, verse 22. Just in the last chapter, they were together. They were more than together, because why did David come? Well, he came because he played the harp. And Saul had this evil spirit, and when David played the harp, the spirit would depart from him. But we read here in 1 Samuel 16, verse 21, and David came to Saul and stood before him, and he, Saul, loved him, David, greatly. And he, David, became his armor bearer. So there's a relationship here. This isn't just who's that kid again who played the harp? No, they know each other. David knows Saul. Saul knows about David. There's a relationship. There's actually an employer-employee relationship, if you want to call it that. So, and Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight." And so, David had actually gone, and he was living in the household of Saul. He was in Saul's employ as an armor bearer. But David was likely one of several armor bearers, probably something of a rotation, where he would have had a period of time where he was serving as Saul's armor bearer, and then the rest of his time he would return, and it wasn't a big difference from Gibeah down to Bethlehem. So he would go, when he wasn't bearing Saul's armor, he would go back home to Bethlehem. So his duties are divided between serving Saul and keeping the sheep of his father. But I want you to remember again what else happened in 1 Samuel 16. What happened early in 1 Samuel 16? Something very significant in the life of David. He was anointed. Anointed what? Anointed king. Okay? So you would think he wouldn't go and he wouldn't broadcast that to Saul, obviously. But his dad knew, his brothers knew, and word would have started to seep out. Hey, David got anointed by Samuel. He was anointed king, and yet what do we find him doing? He's humbly and dutifully involved in the service both to his king, the Lord's anointed, the Lord's other anointed, King Saul, and also to his father. I think that's interesting that a man was as humble as David was. He was anointed king, and yet when his dad said, "I need you to go keep the sheep," David still went and kept the sheep. There was none of this, "Well, actually, Dad, you go keep the sheep because I'm king, actually, and you should know that." No. What does he do? He does exactly what he was supposed to do under God, under his father, under his king. It's interesting that before he was king, he was out in the sheep pastures That's where they found him to anoint him. After he was anointed, before it was God's time for him to take the throne, where do you find David? Where he's supposed to be. He's either serving the king or he's serving his father. Yes, sir.
Who was the leader of the Philistines at that time? Do we know?
I don't think we know his name at this point. We will know a little bit later the name of another Philistine king, but we don't know at this point. Yeah. I'm sure history would probably tell us, but I don't have it off the top of my head.
It more than likely wasn't Goliath.
No. He wasn't a king. He was a common 3 or 4 soldiers, all bundled together and wrapped in armor.
How old was David, you think?
Mid-teens, probably when he was anointed. So depending on how much time passed between chapter 16 and chapter 17, late teen, maybe mid-teen. We see the pictures of him in children's books, and he's 7 or 8. Yeah, I doubt it. He was probably mid to late teenage years when he did this. And then there's another abrupt scene change. Right back to verse 16. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. So we start out in the Valley of Elah. Then we abruptly switch over to David, and then right back to the Valley of Elah. While David's keeping the sheep on the hills of Bethlehem, the hills around Elah echo with Goliath's defiant challenge. But David is going to receive a mission. Now, perhaps we think that David heard of Goliath's challenge, and he told his dad, Jesse, he says, "Father, I need to go save the nation, so I'll see you. Find somebody else to keep the sheep." That's not what happened. He, as far as we know, he had no concept of what was going on. They didn't have social media. I'm sure nobody was posting, hashtag Battle of Elah or whatever down there. That's not going on. So word of mouth would have traveled, but it would have traveled slow on this type of thing. But what brought David to the Elah Valley was far from heroic. Verse 17. And Jesse said unto David his son, "Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren." An ephah is 3/4 of a bushel. So it's a good bit of parched corn. Parched corn is dried grain of some sort. Very likely this is not eared corn. Okay, that wasn't what they did. Mostly they would have had wheat and barley and that type of thing, but very likely this is not a bunch of corn that he has husked, but a grain. And he says, "I want you to run to the camp to thy brethren." Bethlehem to the Valley of Elah. That's 20 miles. That's a long run. That's nothing to sneeze at in its distance. Verse 18, he says, "I want you to take this 3/4 of a bushel of corn. I want you to take these 10 loaves, and I also want you to carry these 10 cheeses." So David's not going to be running anywhere real fast, right? Because he's got a lot of foodstuffs that he's responsible for carrying. "I want you to take these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge." So, bread and grain for his brothers, 10 cheeses to their battalion commander, which is essentially what this man would be. He says, "And look how they fare." That if I were to ask, "How you faring, Sid?" I'm asking, I could just as easily say, "How you doing?" Okay, that's what he's looking for. Go see how they fare. And take their pledge. He's not doing a fund drive for PBS here. Okay, that's not what's going on. He's not, "Will you donate 50? No, that's not the type of pledge. He's going up to his brothers, and when it says to take their pledge, he's going to ask them, "How you doing?" And their response back would be their pledge. This is how I'm doing. My word of how I'm doing. Kind of a different way of phrasing it. Verse 19. "Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the Valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines." Again, 2 armies across a valley from one another would have had some skirmishes. Their guards would have run into our guards and you would have had issues. But it's very largely held in a stalemate. Nobody wants to go first. It's just kind of stuck. You've got Goliath who comes out. He's come out every day for 40 days and he's asked for a challenger. And they're not providing one. So, verse 20, and David arose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. There are a couple things of note in this verse. Number one, David rose up early in the morning. Again, though he'd already been anointed king, though he already knew that ultimately authority would be his obedience was without delay. His dad asked him to do something, Jesse, and he got up and he did it. That's commendable. That's what you look for in a leader. Somebody who does what they're supposed to do, and they do it without delay. Number two, in this verse, what did David do with the sheep?
Made sure of their welfare.
Made sure of their welfare. Again, it's just responsibility. He didn't say, well, Dad wants me to leave, and he walks away from the sheep. No, he takes care of the sheep because duties don't conflict. Okay? Duties don't conflict. He had a duty to the sheep, and his dad told him to do something else. So he arranged for this responsibility to be cared for, and he went and did the next thing. And he's being responsible, seeing to it that his responsibilities, all of them, are cared for. And then he took and went as Jesse had commanded him. His obedience was without delay, it was responsible, and it was complete. He did exactly what his dad told him to do. That means he took the ephah of parched corn, he took the bread, he took the cheeses, and he went, just like he had been told. Again, that's what you're looking for in a king. Remember, 2 chapters ago, God told Saul to do something, and what did Saul do? Would you say that his obedience was without delay and responsible and complete? No. But the way that you can know how David will respond when he has tremendous responsibility is how he's handling these little things. He's supposed to make a food run, and he does it well. So David, he arrives in Elah to the shouts of men preparing to fight. They're setting the battle in array. Verse 21, for Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. Now it would appear from these verses that immediately following that shouting, they're going to clash together. That's likely not what happened. The battle appears to have been largely a shouting match between the Philistines and the Israelites. They're shouting, they're working themselves up like they're going to go fight, but I don't think they do, and the reason I don't think they do is verse 22. It says, and David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, again, notice responsibility on his part, and ran into the army and came and saluted his brethren. Do you figure the army was in the midst of brutal hand-to-hand combat when David walked in and saluted his brothers? Probably not. That would be ridiculous. They're fighting, and David's standing there. Saying, excuse me, guy, how you doing? No, that's probably not how it went down. Okay? Verse 23. And he talked with them. Again, they're not in the midst of pitched battle. They had done their shouting, and then they kind of let it die down. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard him. Goliath comes out as he has the past 40 days, and he repeats the challenge, the same one that we read in verses 8 through 10. We've already looked at it, so we won't again. But Goliath is about to have a major problem because of the last 4 words of verse 23. David heard him. That's going to be a problem for Goliath because Goliath is out there and he's a big guy with a big mouth who's talking an awful lot about Israel and Israel's God. And David is not a big man, but he serves that big God. And he gets upset about it, and he's going to take action on it. But we'll hold here on verse 23 for this evening. Now, for us tonight from this passage, it's important that we don't relegate the historical accounts of Scripture to the level of fairy tales. Hence, pictures, maps, and what we're doing. I hope that as you look at it, you can see a little bit of what it looked like, and you can have those pictures in your mind. It's important because a lot of times we take the big stories, the big well-known stories of Scripture, Moses crossing the Red Sea and Noah's Ark and David and Goliath, and we loop it in there with Rapunzel and Cinderella and all of these other fairy tales that they didn't happen, but this did. It's important for us to remember that. Another thing to note is the continuing, haunting failure of Israel for choosing a leader based on looks. That's not working out well for them. They chose Saul. Why? Well, because he's head and shoulders above everybody else. He's a good-looking guy. He seems like what we're looking for. He'd be able to fight. And when the time comes for a fight, what's Saul do? Well, he goes and hides in the tent with everybody else. Saul looked like a champion. But when the time came, he ran scared like everybody else. 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, a very well-known phrase, man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. God knew what Saul was made of. It's no surprise to God that Saul crumbled under pressure. And Saul will continue to crumble under pressure. He's going to try to interfere with David. We'll see even in this chapter. Lots of things will happen. Meanwhile, the man we know that God will use to champion his cause was faithful in all of the insignificant tasks. David was a dutiful, responsible, and obedient servant of his king, of his father, and we'll see ultimately of his God. In Acts, David is called by God a man after mine own heart. Do you figure David became a man after God's own heart when he first put the crown on his head, or when he first sat on the throne, or when he first walked into Jerusalem? Or do you think, with me, as we read this, that David was a man after God's own heart when he was only ruling over a flock of his dad's sheep? He was a responsible man who proved that he could handle bigger things with how he dealt with little things. The proving ground of the heroic is the mundane. The things that we get up and we faithfully do, day in, day out, the way that we walk with God on a regular basis proves the kind of people we are, proves the kind of people that God can use. So, the Bible tells us in the New Testament, it's required in stewards that a man be found faithful. David was a faithful man. He was faithful over sheep. He was faithful over dried grain. He was faithful over cheese. And eventually, he was faithful over a small group of mighty men. And eventually, he was faithful over an entire nation. So, be faithful in the little things. As David was, take the lessons that we see as we go here through this passage. Any thoughts, questions about what we've looked at here this evening in 1 Samuel 17? Any questions? All right. Well, then we will close in a word of prayer. Our Father, once again, we thank you for the accounts of men like David and even men like Saul who we can look at and see how we should be and how we shouldn't be. Lord, as David was faithful in the little things, I pray that so too we would be. I pray that, Lord, that we wouldn't get caught up in always wanting you to use us for some big thing when we're letting the little things in our life slip by. I pray that we would be faithful, and I pray that you would use us. I pray that you'd use us as we go our separate ways now. I pray you'd give us safety, Lord, and I pray that you'd help us to be effective witnesses for you throughout this week. In Jesus' name.